Welcome to Conversations with Thought Leaders. I am so excited and honored to have my guest, Suzanne Gildert, here with me today. Now, I've known Suzanne for a number of years. She and I worked together on many different singularity projects over the years, and I've watched her change and grow in terms of her area of focus. Now, if you're not familiar with Suzanne, she is absolutely obsessed with understanding the depth of the human mind. Her new project, and it's currently in stealth, is focused on creating technologies to understand, expand, and network human consciousness. Now, that's a big statement. We're going to break that down for you. Suzanne also co-founded Suzanne also co-founded and was CTO of Sanctuary AI. She also founded Kindred AI in 2014. Kindred was acquired by Okado in 2020. Suzanne also has deep expertise in quantum computing from her time at D-Wave Systems and has a PhD in experimental physics from the University of Birmingham, UK. She's also a published digital artist and a poet and has worked as a graphic designer and pioneered a technique for creating art using a quantum computer. Now, that's a lot, Suzanne. And you know what I love about you, there's so many things, but I love your connection between science and art. And I think you're even now moving into some more esoteric realms. We'll get to that a little bit later. But where I'd love to start, today's show is called the scientific question and problem of consciousness. So from a scientific standpoint, consciousness is one of those things that maybe isn't discussed as often. So help us understand through your perspective, what is consciousness and why is this both a problem and an opportunity?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me today, Andrea. This is really exciting. And I'm going to talk about one of the things I'm super passionate about, which is consciousness. And as you were asking, it's one of these things that people have heard of the word. They maybe have some idea of what it is, but it's still a little bit fuzzy and not very well defined. I like to define consciousness as the thing that everyone knows and understands, which is their first-person experience of the world. So the super cool thing about consciousness, when you start talking about, consciousness technologies and things like that, is that everyone knows what consciousness is, even if you don't know it by that word. So everyone has this rich experience of the world, this sensory, emotional, sort of everyday first-person perspective. So even if people don't yet understand what consciousness technologies are, everyone understands what consciousness is at the fundamental level because we experience it every second of the day.
Yeah. And, as I think about consciousness, for me, consciousness is my connection between the body that I experience the world in and the beliefs that I have of other realms, I guess. And it's that connection point. That my consciousness is the connector between both. And so for me, consciousness is something that, first of all, I think as most humans, we take for granted, first of all. And we can't imagine, of course, life without it. But does consciousness also incorporate, in my world, my consciousness is also a link to maybe a higher wisdom of some form. And everybody calls it something different. As you look at this, how does that play into your definition of consciousness?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A lot of people have this idea of intelligence and thinking and thought processes and reasoning and logic when they think about what the mind does. But there's an interesting question of, does it do more than that? So we also have these sort of senses that we some people call it intuition. Some people call it, a sixth sense, or we have these feelings inside us that we're doing more than just thinking. We're doing more than just processing symbols and language and numbers. There's these kind of gut instincts, these feelings that we have. And I think what's going on there is that inside the brain, inside the mind, there's a whole bunch of computing that's going on of the regular type, which is the kind of thing we do in AI and digital systems today, which is that thinking, that processing of zeros and ones. But maybe there's something else going on that we don't quite understand yet, that explains where those kind of weird gut feelings come from when you make a snap decision and you have no idea where that sort of that sensation came from. It just seemed to come out of nowhere. Now, those things, again, they may seem vague and wishy-washy, but I think there's something there. There's a thread to pull on that we can start to unpick with science and with technology and with engineering that will maybe explain some of those more intuitive understandings.
And it's, I mean, I always find science fascinating because, scientists, in my experience, are intensely curious individuals. They're looking at some of the world's biggest problems, life's biggest problems, or challenges, or unexplained mysteries, and trying to find and make sense of those mysteries. And when I think about consciousness and I go down the lens of technology, it takes me to places like, 2001: A Space Odyssey, where we saw, this conscious computer becoming, unglued, really. And I think that I know when you and I were working together a few years ago, and in your previous world through Sanctuary, you were working on, at that time, ultra lifelike robots. And when we look at robots who are ultra lifelike and who have consciousness, or maybe have a brain that may or may not have consciousness, why do we need to know whether they have consciousness? Why is that important?
Yeah, so this really gets to the heart of the question of why is consciousness interesting and important. And I think it's very interesting from the human perspective. So if we forget about robots and AI and all that kind of stuff, just thinking about consciousness and how it works in people is interesting. But the thing is that today we're having this rise of AI, we're having the rise of more and more smart machines. These machines are going to eventually be living amongst us. So there's been, a whole variety of different humanoid robot companies being announced recently. These robots are starting to work in factories. They're starting to work in manufacturing, in warehouses. So, that's okay. They're kind of behind the scenes doing their thing. But at some point, they're going to come out of those factories. They're going to be in our homes. They're going to be walking around in the streets. They're going to be interacting with people. They're going to be moving into occupations that are much more driven by social interaction, by empathy, by conversing with people in a way that goes beyond text, goes into body language and all these things. So the question at that point is, can we get something that really connects with us, that we feel safe working alongside, we're even happy and excited to work alongside these robot co-workers? Or are these things, when they start coming out of these factories, they're just going to be these kind of cold, calculating automata that we really don't enjoy interacting with that much, and we sort of have to. So the difference between those two things, I think, lies in this area of understanding what consciousness is. And as AI keeps progressing, AI is going to get more and more and more like the human mind. And then the sort of scientific argument falls into one of two camps. People believe we're going to keep advancing AI and it will just end up like a person with all the things we have, all the consciousness, all the awareness, all the emotions, all the feelings will just sort of emerge naturally from the AI. And then there's a whole group of different people that believe that will never happen. No matter how much effort we put into AI, these things will never have those properties. So that's the scientific question I'm interested in looking at now.
And I would think, I guess, regardless of which side of that camp you lie on, the question is, well, yeah, are we willing to risk? Are we willing to risk it? Like, so if we believe that, that artificial consciousness will never exist, or artificial life forms will never have consciousness, or that one day that they will eventually become spontaneously conscious, I guess the question is, are we willing to take that risk? Yeah. Because I would think, as I look at, Hollywood gives us many tropes for this very thing, right? And if I look at it, I think, my earlier example of HAL from, 2001: A Space Odyssey, I think that was a depiction, whether true or not, of what a conscious, intelligent artificial intelligent being could look like, because there seemed to be a thought process behind what he was doing, versus the Terminator, who was maybe a smart machine but not conscious, because that machine was taking its direction from a centralized computer that was continuously streaming down. Now, am I right in that? Is that kind of the right now, first of all, the two sides of it? And then secondly, when we look at both of those, now, unfortunately, the tropes that Hollywood has given us in both cases, they're bad, but are those sort of the two sides of what we're really talking about?
Yeah, I think that's a good characterization. I mean, there's lots of different threads with consciousness, but what one particular thing that I guess I'd say I'm worried about, and I try and focus more on the positive and the opportunities here than the risks. But one of the big risks I see is machines not being conscious enough. And so there's a little kind of like thought experiment I want maybe the audience to kind of walk through with me here. So this idea of, say you have a fleet of robots, and there's two options. The first option is that they're not conscious, they have no autonomous kind of behavior, no agency of their own, and they're just listening to orders. So at that point, you've got this fleet that's kind of directed from some centralized system that's giving these orders. So you can think about that as scenario one. And then scenario two is that these systems have their own, or at least some of their own agencies, some of their own independence. They can think for themselves. They make decisions based on intuition and feeling, and they're not just taking orders, although they still have to kind of like do what people want them to do to fit in. But I actually think the second of those will be safer, because what you really don't want is systems that are just blindly following orders without thinking through the consequences of their actions. So by giving these systems a little bit more agency, a little bit more autonomy to think through things themselves, even though that sounds scary, like we're giving machines agency and we're letting them have, some power and some control, I actually think it will be safer, because those machines are now able to decide whether the action they're taking is good or bad.
As I hear that, because I fully agree. I think that when we have discernment within those that are making any type of decision, even if it's just the decision on, which task to choose, discernment is the piece that's essential. And discernment really only comes either with very complex programming, but even then you can't program for all scenarios. So discernment is a very, very difficult thing versus, just following orders. So I agree. But with that, I wonder, and I think really where you're stepping into the place of is the ethical and moral boundaries that are required, because, as we move further down this road of creating consciousness in whatever form that could be. And I wonder if there are levels of consciousness, and that might be another question. But when we go down that road of ethical and moral, how in a conscious machine are you in fact? And again, that's probably not even the right terminology. It's funny, in our world of political correctness, I'm like, oh, am I using language that is really, not good for this? But, in an intelligent, artificial life form, I guess, and even that feels odd. Are there moral boundaries or ethical guidelines that get instilled in programming or in memory? Like, this is where it's like, is it programming anymore if they're conscious, or is it memory? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think even what we're seeing just with our conversation now is how difficult these topics are, how muddled our language, our definitions are. Even, I've been trying to think about this for a while, and even I have a problem like what word to use when. But that's why I think we need to focus more on this. I think we need to dig deep into what is consciousness? What do we understand about it? Can we bring science and engineering to this realm that seems very slippery and difficult? And I think by trying to do that, we're actually going to start coming up with better definitions, especially when it's applied to AI systems and things like that. And a lot of these ethical and moral questions will start to become better defined, because I think one of the reasons it's difficult to answer questions about ethics and morality in these systems is that we just don't have good definitions at the moment for a whole bunch of things. So it's not that the questions It's not that the problems themselves are difficult, it's that we can't even really define the problem that we're trying to solve. And so I think putting more attention on this and not being afraid of consciousness. So, if consciousness is very difficult, it's a slippery subject, we don't even have a way of measuring it that's using the current scientific method. So the only way we can measure consciousness is through our experience.
Right.
So immediately that's terrifying to scientists, because you can't use this sort of objective third person looking at something from the outside to know what consciousness is. So we have to come up with new, interesting scientific techniques to really dig deep into this. And then when I think we do, that'll give us better definitions, better understandings, and then the ethical, moral questions will then start to be answered more clearly.
One of the things that I've come to understand deeply is that, history and the victor is often in the through the lens of the person who writes the story. And, when we think historically about even touching on some of these questions, and really a lot of them have been grappled with through more religious means.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about how our religion has treated the stories that have come down and the stories that we're going to create as your work and the work of those like you who are going down this road of consciousness are going to create, I think it's really important. I was at an event earlier this week where the speaker, Katie Ward, talked about the story of Adam and Eve, and more specifically Eve. And she had this line that has stayed with me where she said, in the moment that Eve took the bite of the apple, in that moment, she became godlike for a moment as she created the opportunity for the garden to evaporate and for she and Adam to experience life for the first time. And I think as you think about this work and the consciousness that you are looking for, and actually we've got a question from Justina, which is what kind of consciousness exactly? What is that consciousness that you're trying to pull and tease out through the work you're doing?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think this idea of like what is consciousness, it's very subjective. It's very difficult to pin it down. But the way I think about it right now is when you're awake, you're going about your day, you're experiencing the world, you're having this sensation that this kind of like a movie playing inside your head, like you are having experience right now. There's sights, there's sounds, there's smells, there's emotions, all that together kind of comes together like an orchestra. It's like a symphony of all these different sort of sensations that are playing out. So what I want to know is that happening in other systems, right? Mm-hmm. So when it's not a great definition, but I think are other things having that same feeling, that same sensation as me? Or the alternative is, the lights are out, there's no experience. And so I like to think of this thought experiment where I just go around your house and think like, well, is my washing machine having this experience?
Right.
Probably not. But inside your washing machine is a tiny integrated circuit, a chip that's processing zeros and ones, at least when it's running. It's tiny, it's doing a very simple program, but it's computing something. Is it conscious? Most people would say absolutely not. That's ridiculous. Now go to your desktop PC. Is that conscious? Probably not. It's doing a lot more processing. It's running complex GPU processes. So maybe that's not conscious as well. Now go to a self-driving car. Is that having an experience?
Right.
Or is a large language model like ChatGPT running on all those like mega servers? Is that conscious? Now is that having an inner world experience, an inner rich sensory experience of the world? So now you can see we start to get in just by asking this question, does it feel like something to be ChatGPT? That starts to get to this definition. It's still difficult to pin down even then.
And it feels like really what you're saying is, does it have an awareness of itself and the environment?
Well, it's an awareness of everything, yeah.
Yes, it's like it's an aware, but it's the inward awareness that it exists, and then the outward awareness that it has a relationship to everything around it.
That's
So
right.
do I exist? And if I do, what is my relationship to
Yeah.
all things around me? And
And
that's
part
a
of
big
the reason, yeah, part of the reason this is so tricky to wrap your head around, because it's a bit like the analogy of the goldfish in the bowl of water. It has never known anything other than being in water. So
right.
you ask the goldfish, what's water? It's like, I don't know. You know, it's so familiar to it, and
Yes.
conscious experience is so familiar to us. It's so everyday, it's so mundane almost. We take it for granted. We stop questioning it. It's just there. It's just what is. And
Right.
it's like, no, we have to understand why that is, and why a desktop PC isn't experiencing that same thing.
So from one of our listeners, Loki, has asked, what role do philosophers of mind play in forming a scientific approach to consciousness? Philosophers have been working on a consciousness and theories of mind for many decades and developed a range of tools, frameworks, and definitions.
Yeah.
So are you working within any of these philosophical models, or are you taking some of these, sort of scientific approaches that are already existing and looking at them? Or are you, because you're looking through the lens of tech, kind of going, well, let's just actually come at it through a completely different lens?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very important when you're creating something new, that you stand on the shoulders of giants. So all this work that's been done on the philosophy of consciousness, the nature of the mind, idealism versus physicalism, all these kind of questions that have been asked for, hundreds of years, if not more than that, are absolutely relevant today. What I'm trying to bring to the equation, and not just me, but sort of the next generation of, I guess, consciousness researchers or consciousness engineers, if you like, are what modern tools and technologies have we developed recently that can help us go back and look at some of these philosophical questions in a new light. So that's sort of what's new. And the new tools we have that we haven't had before are things like large AI models. They're things like robotics, that we can actually maybe put systems into robots and see how they're behaving. Are they behaving like they're conscious? They're things like brain-computer interfacing technologies, where we can actually start to connect electrical systems into the brain, so we can send, information in and out of the brain. How does that affect the mind? There's another, I could go on and on. There's quantum computing, which allows us to simulate chemical reactions inside the brain more effectively. So, if you take an anesthetic, your consciousness goes away. So some small chemical molecules are somehow going into your brain, interacting with something, and your consciousness goes away. So using new tools like quantum simulation, could we understand a little bit more about consciousness? So absolutely, all the historical legacy stuff about philosophy of mind and consciousness is absolutely vital to understand and respect. But I think new tech tools can take that even further.
Yeah, as I'm listening
and hi,
to you,
Loki, by the way.
yeah. I'm listening to you and realizing, I remember working a few years ago, and you and I've talked about this, and I think it's a fascinating concept, right? When you take away when you use anesthetic, you take away consciousness. And we think about, like, we go to sleep, we are unconscious. Does that mean our conscious has gone away? Or does it mean that we are no longer aware of the consciousness? And I do remember working with another scientist, Dr. Divya Chander, a few years ago, and she had this concept. She's an anesthesiologist. And I remember her saying to me, when I take away consciousness, when I put a patient under, we take away consciousness, we administer a paralytic, and we administer a muscle relaxant, because that's part of what they're doing, of course, as somebody is going under for an operation. And she said, you would think that the brain would quiet at that point. You would think that everything would go flat, because really there's nothing more for the brain to do at that point. There's no autonomic, we're breathing for them, we're taking care of their body. And yet the brain goes off the chart. The activity within the brain off the chart.
Yeah.
And is that what you're trying to harness? What is that? What is happening there?
Yeah, there's some really tantalizing clues in kind of observations, empirical observations like that. And the cool thing about the one you mentioned is that the opposite is true in some forms of meditation. So
Right.
these master Buddhist monks have been studied in fMRI machines and things like this. And when they go into these states of consciousness that are they describe as being massively expanded, massively aware, so you're kind of having a much higher energy state, if you like. What you'd think was happening is that the brain would be like lighting up and firing and all this, but what they see is the brain actually goes completely silent. So
Which is
that's the
fascinating, right?
opposite of the anesthetic effect. And it seems to me like there's a tantalizing clue there that maybe the brain is doing something that can't purely be explained by these neurons firing. Maybe there's some other process going on. There are some quantum computing theories of consciousness that if some quantum effects are going on, we might not be able to see those using MRI and things like that. So again, I'm not like biased one way or the other. I'm trying to be scientific about this, but I'm also open-minded to some
Right.
of these weird little paradoxes that can't be explained using our current theories of how the brain works.
You and I could talk about the philosophical side of this, I know, all day, but I noticed that Nicholas, who is one of our viewers as well, has just asked about your stealth business. And, what he's bringing us back to is like scientific curiosity is amazing, but is there a business model?
Yeah.
And so as you think about, what you're doing, beyond curiosity, because I think it is an incredibly curious thing, is there a business model for why you would go down this road?
Mm-hmm.
What is it you're thinking from the perspective
Yeah.
of the stealth startup that you have?
That's right. So again, I think that there could be massive business opportunities in like understanding consciousness. So why do I think that? It's important to realize that there has to be kind of a long R&D phase before we can actually get to productizing things. But I've always thought the best way to understand something is to try and build it. And the best way to try and build something is to try and create a commercial product, because then you have this massive pressure on you, like it has to work. It has to actually be a legitimate new technology. That's why I like the kind of vehicle of a startup. So there's two areas I think that could be commercially relevant here. So the first one is in AI systems. So we're building bigger and bigger and bigger AI systems. And if it turns out, like a lot of people believe, AI is not just going to be canonically conscious. It's not just going to emerge and become conscious on its own. Again, we don't know the answer to this question yet, but a lot of people are in that camp. If that's true, then there is a huge market opportunity for a consciousness module, if it could be developed, to plug into AI systems, to imbue them with our abilities as humans, our intuition, our feelings, our sensations, our agency, our ability to make good decisions. So that's one kind of commercial bucket. The other one is on the human side of things. So this, like I said, consciousness is everything we are. We don't understand what it is. So I think if we can understand consciousness, we can also create products and technologies that make us better, that expand our consciousness, that make us better able to understand the feelings and experiences of others. So you might say that falls into like the wellness or therapeutic category, but I think that there's a there. Yes. And so who knows what this could be, but especially with brain-computer interfacing technologies, this rising tide of other converging technologies that enable potentially in the future consciousness to become a new area of not just science, but engineering and technology. I think now is a time to kind of get ahead of the curve, starting to think about these ideas.
Yeah, I feel like you're right in the place, if and we've talked about this a little bit, where Tim Berners-Lee was, 40 years ago, right?
I love this analogy. It's like going back 40 years and saying to Tim Berners-Lee, what is the internet for? What are the products going to be? What is the ethical consequences of the internet? And it's kind of like, well, it doesn't exist yet. We don't really know the answers to any of these questions, but we have a feeling it's worth exploring, networking computer systems together. We just think there'll be some really useful things that come out of that. And who could have predicted like social media and streaming videos on LinkedIn and all this, but it's now happening. So I think the same is true with consciousness.
Yeah, like I think it's valuable to think about that. I think that we look back on some of these pioneers who have created things that have literally changed civilization. I mean, I think we can all agree that the internet has changed every aspect of who we are on this earth, like it has touched us in so many different ways. But 40 years ago, no, we couldn't have imagined it.
Yeah.
It
And
just
in fact, it was dismissed as a bunch of scientists and researchers playing with their computers.
a fad. I mean, how many times was it called a
Mhm.
fad? I remember those days, right? Oh, it'll go away.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I guess the same could be said for, the telephone. And like technology, I think it is one of the things that it has given us over time, is that what we don't know coming into new tech is what the implications of it will be long term. We can see the short term problem solve. And so in this case, the short term problem solve that you're looking at is really, and it, just if I think about the philosophical questions we were talking about, is choosing to be choosing to create consciousness versus risking consciousness becoming spontaneous without any ability for us to know when, where, and how that happens. And that becomes very risky if we're relying upon these smart technologies in ways that our lives depend upon.
Mhm.
And spontaneously consciousness appears, I would imagine that could be very risky.
Yeah, I like to say that it doesn't matter which of these camps you're in. So if you believe consciousness will spontaneously pop out of AI, or if you believe it never will, I think in both of those situations, we need to understand more about it and have it sort of able to be something we can engineer and something we can control and shape and explore and scientifically understand. Because, if it's just going to suddenly pop out of AI, then what on earth are we going to get? We're going to get something completely random that's maybe not conscious like we are at all. It's conscious in some weird alien way. We're going to need to understand the consciousness at that point. So whether you believe it's going to organically emerge or it's never going to be conscious unless we kind of create some kind of special new technology, I think we need to explore consciousness technologies either way.
Suzanne, this has been fascinating, enlightening, and I could talk all day. We've already gone through a half an hour. I can't believe it. Like I said, we could talk forever. I want to thank you, first of all, for sharing some of the exciting and truly groundbreaking work that you're doing. And how can our guests keep in touch with you?
Yeah, so the best way to follow me at the moment is on LinkedIn and Twitter. It's just my name, Suzanne Gildert. I'm the only one in the world, so I'm pretty easy to find as long as you remember there's a D in my name, not a B, because that's a common problem people have. So yeah, LinkedIn, Twitter, and if you follow me on those platforms, I'll be doing some announcements very soon about a new mailing list newsletter we're going to have with the new venture. So yeah, that's the best way to find out.
Well, I definitely follow you, and I love all of the things that you are doing. So thank you so much for all of your hard work and what you're doing to really untangle this scientific question and problem of consciousness. And thank you to everybody who joined us here live today. We will be back in a couple of weeks. Stay tuned for the guest announcement. We will have it for you probably next week. Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you back here in 2 weeks with another conversation with thought leaders. I'm Andrea Sampson. I'll see you then.